Good evening. I'd like to call this regular meeting of the Jamestown Public School Board to order. It is September 19th, 2022, and it's 5:15 p.m., and we're in the Thompson Community Room of the Jamestown Middle School. I'd also like to note that prior to this meeting, we started facility tours at 4 p.m. at Louis L'Amour Elementary and then moved to Washington Elementary. I'd like to recognize all those in the audience and thank you for joining us this evening. Please join me in the Pledge of Allegiance. I pledge allegiance to the flag of the United States of America and to the republic for which it stands, one nation, under God, indivisible, with liberty and justice for all. Jason, would you read the school board norms, please?
The board developed norms are to share and respect varied opinions and speak with a united voice once a decision has been reached, to prudently prioritize resources in a student-centric manner that aligns with the district's strategic plan, to exhibit a mindset of continuous improvement through adequate preparation for meetings and a commitment to board education, to commit to assessing board effectiveness to ensure high-quality governance for the staff, students, and community of Jamestown.
Thank you, Jason. Under public communications, we have a couple thank you cards that are just being passed around, so make sure you get a chance to read those. Does anyone have any conflicts of interest to declare for this evening? Any conflicts of interest? Any conflicts of interest? Moving on. Consent agenda. Is there a motion? Motion by Gail to approve the consent agenda. Is there a second? Second by Steve. Any discussion? Anything you would like pulled off? At any time, a board member can pull off anything from the consent agenda. There being no discussion, all those in favor say aye. Aye. Opposed, same sign. Motion carried. Under the regular agenda, nothing under recognition, nothing under correspondence. Under reports, student council report. Please come forward and introduce yourself.
Hello, I'm Will Nelson. I am the student council president up at the high school. I'm here to offer my report. We've had about a month of student council. Now our first meeting was on August 15th, and in that time we have already had homecoming, which is pretty early for JPS. But we got a lot done. We created 4 committees, one for the parade, one for the rally and coronation that we held at the high school, one for our t-shirts, which I'll go into a little bit later, and then another one also just for extraneous details. So the 2 biggest committees that we had to deal with were the t-shirt committee. It's a newer initiative that we've had at the high school where we try to provide every student with a free Jamestown High School t-shirt. In years past, we've done shirts that say Jamestown High School homecoming, and they may have the opposing football team in the games, a helmet on there. This year we decided not to go with that design, and we just got a regular Jamestown High School shirt. We talked with Mr. Gale, and we got a date 1879 to 2022, the history of Jamestown Public Schools, just something that students can wear all year round to whatever Blue Jay event they'd like to go to. And I think we ended up ordering 801 shirts. The price was about 2.5 times this year what it was last with inflation and things like that. But fortunately, we had over 15 community sponsors, most of them donating above $300. All of their logos went on the back of the shirt if they donated in excess of $300. I think in the end we raised $3,400, little over. And we were really happy to see that. Last year they raised about $1,700, so we had a lot more support from the community this year. The other big thing that we did this year was the dance. Normally we hold it at the high school, but we decided it might be better to hold it at the bunker. And I was just talking with Mr. Conway, the assistant principal today, and they counted the money, and we had 2 times the turnout we did last year. Instead of 150 students, we had 300 students attend the dance, and we raised over $1,300, which will help us pay for the remainder of the cost with the t-shirt fundraiser. So we were very pleased to see that and very encouraged for turnout for events during the rest of the school year. Other than that, now we kind of have time to begin talking about new initiatives that we want to work on this year with student council. New ideas that our members are going to bring, and hopefully students propose to members for us to bring forward. So now that we got homecoming out of the way, we have a little time to do some new stuff. So if any of you have any questions.
Diane.
Yes, thank you for your report. And I heard through the grapevine that the dance was hugely successful and that Mr. Gaylor and some administrators were out there on the dance floor. So that was really wonderful. And the second thing I had was, when you go to put student council officers in place, do you have a pretty good turnout, or do you feel like you have to search for people that want to be on the student council?
Unfortunately, this has at least in my tenure in student council, I was in middle school student council, I was a middle school student council president, and then I've been class president all the way up to now being executive president of the high school student council. And I have noticed that, and a lot of our members have taken note that since the pandemic, we've had a lot harder time getting people to join student council. We don't know if it's just students are less engaged, but we do have to ask people to join. Usually filling those higher up positions, the executive positions, isn't as hard, but for our senior class, we had to do quite a bit of asking to get people to participate. We're very grateful for the members who did choose to partake, but it took a little bit of asking. So we're seeing a little change there with a little less reputake in the student body for the opportunity to serve in student council. We're hoping that this year we make a really good year and people are excited to join us next year, hopefully.
Any other questions? Perfect. Thank you. Oh, yeah, go ahead, Gal.
I just want to thank you for all your hard work and coming to take the time to visit with us. And if you ever need anything from us, let us know. Thank you, Will.
Perfect. Thank you.
Thank you, and thank you to the community sponsors also that supported the T-shirts, and that sounds like a
Yes, very
successful.
grateful for them.
And you said 801 T-shirts.
Yes,
That's
we
great.
ended up ordering, I think, about 740 for students and 61 for staff. So
I love seeing that Jamestown High School and Blue Jay spirit. That's awesome.
Yeah,
Thank
it's
you.
very good. All
Thank you
right.
for your report. We really
Yes.
enjoy having you come. So,
Thank you.
all right. So moving on, under Board Education, we have Strategic Competency, Career and Technical Update. Mr. Heinert, please join us.
Well, thank you for inviting me this evening. Just wanted to give a quick update with where our grant is currently at and the process of what we've been going through since the submission. At this time, federal funds have not been released from the CTE side. There's been some broadband projects that have been promoted and supported through that grant opportunity, but those are not necessarily tied to CTE. Those are more to the broadband side of things in terms of creating greater equity for digital education across the state, especially for smaller communities. And so that's been the by and large, the lion's share of the funds that have been released at this time. And I checked with our state director, Wade Sick, last week Friday, and there has been no change up to this point. He is in the process of developing an ask from our legislature to help fund the sides of the grant that the federal funds have not supported yet. And that's a large ask, about $88 million in total, just from the state in terms of the initial grant in itself. The costs of construction have gone up. And so with that would probably be about another $30 million asked. So the total request of the legislature will be somewhere in the neighborhood of $120 million. I wish I could tell you that 100% of that will be funded. I can't guarantee that. It's a wait and see right now. And so we're still waiting and hoping and optimistic. I really am intrigued with the initiatives that our grant would support. I look at that as being a good step forward for the students who participate in CTE. And I'm hoping that very soon we have some better news for you. So anyways, do you have any questions regards to the process or?
Dr. Luck, go ahead.
Darby, just so everybody can be reminded of the great projects, just for a reminder, this is part of the match grant that we utilized ESSER funds to support. Mr. Gaylor, Mr. Heinert wrote a grant to the state to match that, and if you would be willing to talk about the projects that were initially in that application, although we know, and we're already talking
Right.
18 months since that initial application, somewhere in that range?
So there's three big pieces to it, and the first one would be an addition to the south side of the Career and Tech, and that would support construction. We currently build lake cabins there. We've built sheds, and so half of that space would be devoted to construction, and we believe we could support 2 lake cabin builds at one time if that were to be developed. The other half of that building would support EMS and EMT training, and so that's through an agreement with Ringdale Ambulance Service. And the neat thing about that is the fact that we would have 24/7 ambulance service finally on the northeast side of town, and so that would be a great opportunity in terms of shared resources. We already have a lot of EMT and EMR people from our community and from other surrounding communities that come to our center for Pearson testing. So it just makes sense to have those resources there. I'll be honest with you, I appreciate just having those people on campus. All right, it's especially when you think of how many kids we have right next door across the street at the high school. So yes, it would be obviously a great bond or a great partnership with that group. We'd also do some expansion with the transition house, and so the idea there would be to create a full commercial kitchen and to provide some opportunities for our students that reside in that school, but also support our CTE side of things. Right now we have 11 kids enrolled in our food processing class, and truth be told, that is tight quarters in our current situation for our foods lab. And so, and you think of 11, that's really not that big. But for that space, it's very small. And so a larger commercial kitchen to support those programs and provide opportunities for the kids, that transition house is also a goal there too. We're also looking at a new greenhouse, all right, with that process. And so that would be just on the products that we would grow, the food that we'd produce there in that greenhouse we could actually serve, in that kitchen area that we'd be expanding in the transition house. So some great opportunities there. It's very difficult for students that might be handicapped to access our greenhouse with the floor. So to have one smooth, flat surface for them to have access to, it would also have raised garden beds for students who have wheelchair access to be able to participate in those programs. And so we look at that as being very valuable to allow greater equity for those kids that have those challenges.
Thank you, Mr. Heinert. Are there other questions from the board? All right. We appreciate you coming tonight and giving us an update, and wait to hear the next update.
Okay, thank you.
Thank you.
Yep.
Moving on, number E, Superintendent's Report. Dr. Leck.
Thank you. You have my written report. I'll just briefly touch on some items, spend a little more time on others. But as we've talked about before, board retreat, if you have board retreat items, we're looking in January. So if you have something that you'd like for Dr. Larson, myself to consider as we break down an agenda, send that my way. And also, if you're attending NDSBA conference and you haven't talked with Amy, please do that as soon as possible, or she will continue to call you. School compliance reports, that's an item that's on your agenda. And I added this in my report just to provide a little bit of history. In the past, the reason for the school compliance reports is it's a part of accreditation. In the past, before they transitioned to this program, or this process, I should say, school accreditation was interesting because we would start the process in the beginning of the year, and sometime around May, we would get approved for accreditation. So when you had a week left of school or so, you would get your notice that you were fully accredited. And so they transitioned this, and this is, boy, it's been a while, probably 10 years or so, but they transitioned to the school compliance process. And so each school, the administrator in each building reviews all of these various assurances, and they say, well, we follow the law in this. We are certified. All of our staff are certified. And I've given you those school compliance reports, and you can see how each school has answered, their assurances. So when they sign them, it shows that that they're in compliance. But in each of these, your responsibility as a board is to approve the LEA compliance report. That assumes then that all of your school compliance reports are approved. So you give me authority to submit the LEA compliance report. We're required by law to do that before October 1st. And so we work this process out to ensure that we can get that done, and that means tomorrow I'll be submitting the LEA compliance report, assuming that's approved by the board. Updates on facility projects, as we have done. I provide meeting notes and progress reports. I know I've gotten a lot of feedback from staff and from board members that look at those. They appreciate those progress reports, the pictures, and being able to track to see what's being done. And so I won't go through that unless there's questions of me. I will go through briefly the change orders that are upcoming. We continue to see a number of them at the Gusner project, and we're up to 14 now. Change request 10 relates to acoustical ceilings. That's adding acoustical ceilings. CCR, the change order 11, that is in the pod. We are adding 2 control devices that are electronic. It was missed in the plans that those 2 pneumatic devices remained. And to access the new system, they have to be electronic. So that addresses that. There's some exterior concrete and sidewalk that's being done in the back side, so the north side of Gusner Elementary. And since the contractor is there, it makes sense to do that additional excavation and work as well. It's just more efficient to do that. It needed to be addressed anyway. It just expedites that, and it's more efficient. It's kind of a catch-all. Change order 13 is kind of a catch-all with a ton of different construction work that was done by Hillerud Construction. There's different cabinet work and infills and some construction to hide some piping, some demo work that they did, and then 2 deducts were also included in that. That's why it's such a small amount. There were some other deducts that they saved us some money on, so you see that represented there too. The last is change order 14. That's 2 additional fire alarm devices for our fire suppression upgrade. And I would pause just to ask the question, is this enough information for change orders? Do you want more information? I know sometimes I'll always be willing to ask questions. Sometimes I get questions that come about and say, hey, I need a little bit more information on change order 12 or something else. Am I providing you the information you want on these? Do you want more, or is this general enough with questions later? Is that fine? Okay. Just want to make sure that you have enough. We did hold a pre-construction meeting for our Lincoln Elementary parking lot project. Very happy with how that's going thus far. I feel that's been moving along, and they should anticipate that timeline of being completed by October 8th. So I think that's right in time, and a pretty expedited process, but I think from all indications that should be working well. And the question was brought up before about using contingency dollars to pay for the Lincoln Elementary. That's not part of our summer projects plan, because that came up after that was approved, as you know. So I did a little breakdown, and you can see how we could fund that just strictly through contingency. There's more than enough funding available in the contingencies to cover. Right now, the contingency balance for the design contingencies is a little over $32,000. The Gusner, that amount, when you consider change order 12, we didn't have that initially when I wrote this, and I approximated it, and it's actually $32,000, or a shade over $32,000 for the contingency at Gusner. Much healthier amount at Jamestown Middle School at $69,000, and the high school is still at $26,000. A little over 26. So you're talking around $164,000, and that cost for the Lincoln Elementary project is under $90,000. So more than enough to cover the cost of that project, and I know that there was a question there. Facility tours and building meetings. We did conduct a tour of Louis L'Amour and Washington Elementary right before this meeting. And then our next one is at the middle school. So at 4 o'clock on October 3rd, we'll conduct a tour here at this building. We'll take a little more time here. It's a larger building. We did 2 single sections, which, as we talked about in our tour, is a nice juxtaposition between our newest elementary, even though it's 40 years old, but our newest elementary building and then our oldest single section building. It's a contrast between buildings for sure. We'll take a little more time in this building because it's larger, of course, but also because of some of the construction that's happened. I'm sure there'll be more questions, and we'll want to show a little bit more about what occurred in that facility project as well. So October 17th, the Transition House in Gusner. We'll meet in the library at Gusner Elementary. November 7th, tour of Lincoln and Roosevelt, and then we'll meet back in Thompson Community Room. And the 21st, the tour of JVCTC and the high school, followed by the board meeting in the high school library. The budget hearing is coming up at 6 o'clock. Typically, what the board has done, and I would recommend this too, is once you hit 6 o'clock, no matter what we're doing, we just pause and move into that meeting. Just in the event somebody has come for that meeting that's posted at 6 o'clock, we could certainly just delay, but I think it's respectful to do that. I have traditionally provided a board memo and just a brief presentation that oftentimes answers a lot of questions, so we'll if the board would so allow, I would do that again. I provided a little bit of information on we were awarded that Building Tomorrow's Leaders grant that supports service learning projects for ninth graders in civics. We were awarded that. Transportation agreement is upcoming for approval to share transportation with St. John's Academy for this upcoming year. We have a policy coming on medical marijuana that is being recommended for approval. As I've talked through in the board report, there's potential for confusion between a handful of policies, specifically ACBD, that's the Administration of Medicine to Students, policy FFA, which is student alcohol and other drug use and abuse, policy ABBA, which is important because it outlines electronic smoking devices, and it defines what those are. And so there's an opportunity for confusion or conflict between policies, and we want to be very certain that we are following state law, which is 19.24.1. Specifically, if you look to subsection 33, so 19-24.1-33, that relates to locations, prohibitions for locations, specifically on a school bus, on school grounds in which activities are occurring, and then school grounds themselves. Opportunity for confusion, so we want to make sure that we have a policy that's very clear for all involved. And I can't reinforce enough that we are not making a judgment on the use. That is not our purview to decide. That is law. We are talking specifically about use on school campus. And so we want to be very clear about those prohibitions, what exists in policy, but also what exists in state law. And so we just want to be really clear, and so everybody knows has clear expectations from staff to students to families. And again, we aren't making a judgment. This is simply about location. You know, where does that occur, and how does that conflict or complement existing policies that we have? So I'm going to pause if there's questions on that one.
Any questions from the board? Okay.
Okay. The last thing that I had was an enrollment and facilities task force. We've talked about this for a couple of years, and for various reasons, that's, we've had to prioritize other responsibilities and other things, but the reality is that we need to have a conversation about enrollment and facilities in our district. We've had conversations about facilities in the past. We haven't always tied all of those areas together. And we need to really engage our community in a dialogue about what's happening in our district in terms of enrollment, what's occurring in our districts with aging facilities, how does that impact financial planning. Those don't happen exclusively of each other. These are things that have a connection to each other, and we have to have a good conversation. And I say this with all sincerity, this is not a task force that has an end in mind. We are not saying we want to have this task force so we can do X. We are trying to have this task force and this community engagement so we can decide what that is. What does our community support? What does our community want to do? How are we going to address these concerns that are coming? The reality is we've talked in terms of enrollment for a few years. We know that there's a bubble, an enrollment bubble, and it's at the high school. And we know that we have other options in our community lower than high school. Even when you consider those enrollments in home education or in private education, grades 9 through 12 is higher than anywhere else. And there's a bubble coming. and we have to be prepared for how we're going to address the bubble. When I first came to Jamestown, it would be commonplace for us to be thinking about a K through 5 enrollment of about 1,000, 975. That was typical. Now we're closer to 890, 900. As that shift has come, we need to think what is appropriate for our district around all of those areas, aging facilities, enrollment trends, and how we're going to plan appropriately. And that obviously connects to school finance and long-range financial planning. That's just the reality. And we'll talk about budget in the budget hearing about how all of that connects together. But we just have to have an honest, open dialogue about what that means and what does our community say, and what are solutions that we can find together to address those concerns. And so I did put together a task force kind of breakdown that I shared with the facilities committee, and that's a tentative, just kind of a template for now. I'm sure it'll grow over time, but the reality is if we don't put dates to it, it's easy for it to just delay. And that's easy for me to do that. And I wanted to make sure that we had accountability to doing this task force and timing that out to make sure that it occurs. And so that would start in a selection process now, an initial meeting in October, and the initial plan is to have a recommendation on what we found in this task force, a representative task force, in April. So when I say representative, I mean teachers, community members, parents, school board members, interested folks, making sure that we are representing our community in all perspectives on that committee, and not just one, and not just those that have the loudest voice, or I'm coming to the table to make sure that we do this. Well, this isn't the committee for you. We want to have a committee that looks at data and looks at variables and helps us come to the right decision as a school district. So questions on this task force? Okay, with that, I would just generally stand for questions.
Any questions? Diane?
Going back to the Lincoln parking lot, I just wanted the public to know that once we knew that this was needed, we moved as quickly as we can. And it's during the school year, but that's how it played out. And the question I have is, I don't see it impacting the traffic flow for drop-off and pickup much, but will there be a day or more when 3rd Avenue Northeast has to be closed down?
So as they're trying very hard to have as minimal impact as possible, and that's why the meetings like our pre-construction meeting is so important, to connect Mrs. Schmidt, Jerome Wagner, Strata, and so we can get together and have the least amount of impact. But anytime anything's going to be problematic, we have our call system that will notify parents, and we'll make sure that people are communicated with the best that we can. And you're absolutely right, Diane. Typically, what would happen is in the spring, we would have a summer projects plan. Well, this occurred after that was already approved. And so I would say we moved about as quickly as you can move to get something like this occurring. It is unfortunate that it happens during the school year, but I think with good communication and a little bit of grace, I think we'll be able to get through it, in that month pretty well.
Any other questions about Dr. Leck's superintendent's report? Jason, go ahead.
Whereabout did we end up with kindergarten enrollment in regards to what was projected?
So we're about, so do you mean what was projected in the enrollment demographics, or just kind of general trends?
Enrollment.
So in the demographics report that was done for the district 5 years ago, that was the second one. We did one 7 years ago too. But the last one we did, we kind of had a standard of about 160. And now we're closer in this year to about 140, 138. It's certainly a lot more than what we said, or what we were concerned about in April when it was in the low 70s. But as I talked about at our last meeting, I believe, we have to do something different in terms of how we're registering. The format that we've outgrown. We're not getting people in to register, so we're going to have to do something different. But we're working on that. Can I answer your question?
Thank you, Jason. Any other questions? Moving forward, nothing under old F, under old business. G, under new business, we have number 1, activities, nothing under activities. 2, buildings and grounds. A, approval of change order number 10 for Gusner Elementary Facility Project. This is the acoustic ceiling. Is there a motion? Motion by Gail. Is there a second? Second by Diane. Any discussion? All those in favor, say aye. Aye. Opposed, same sign. Motion carried. B, is there a motion for approval of change order number 11 for the Gusner Elementary Facility Project? This is adding the two control electronic devices in the pod. Is there a motion? Motion by Melissa. Second by Gail. Any discussion? All those in favor, say aye. Aye. Opposed, same sign. Moving, motion approved. C, approval of change order number 12 for Gusner Elementary Facility Project. This is the additional concrete. Is there a motion?
I would move to approve change order number 12.
Motion by Jason. Is there a second? Second by Gail. Any discussion? There being no discussion, all those in favor say aye. Aye. Opposed, same sign. Motion carried. D, approval of change order number 13 for Gusner Elementary Facility Project. This is just that cabinetry, finish work kind of stuff that Dr. Luck discussed. Is there a motion? Motion by Melissa. Second by Gail. Any discussion? There being no discussion, all those in favor say aye. Aye. Opposed, same sign. Motion approved. E, approval of change order number 14 for Gusner Elementary Facility Project. This is the 2 additional fire alarm devices. Is there a motion? Motion by Melissa. Second by Jason. Any discussion? Any discussion? There being no discussion, all those in favor say aye. Aye. Opposed, same sign. Motion carried. Number 3, nothing under curriculum assessment and instruction. 4, finance. Under A, you'll find the general fund balance there for your information. Is there any questions from the board about that? Okay. B, approval of monthly financial reports. Is there a motion? Motion by Gail. Is there a second? Second by Steve. Any discussion? Any discussion? All those in favor, say aye. Aye. Opposed, same sign. Motion approved. C, approval of budget revision for 2022 to 2023 school year. Is there a motion?
I would move to approve budget revisions.
Motion by Jason. Second by Diane. Sally, did you want to comment on this for a minute?
Yeah, this is, kind of unusual, but it's a Choice Ready grant that requires a budget revision. The deadline to submit it is September 22nd, so that's why it's kind of an odd time, for the CTC. And so I'm asking you to approve this so that we can submit the funds before deadline of September 22nd and receive those funds, so.
Thank you, Sally. Any questions for Sally? So we have a motion and a second for approval of budget revisions for the 2022 to 2023 school year. Any more discussion? All those in favor, say aye. Aye. Opposed, same sign. Motion carried. D, approval of transportation agreement with St. John's Academy. Is there a motion? Motion by Diane. Is there a second? Second by Gail. Any discussion on this? Jason, go ahead.
This is pretty standard from what we've done before with St. John's. I mean, no changes there.
So it is, we're in our second year. We have a formula that bases this on our per rider costs above what we receive for state aid. So it's a per rider based on our funding cap. We saw a higher number last year, but that's because we received less from the state. We received less from the state because of, we're a year behind. So we got less transportation funding in that year because of COVID, because we weren't transporting students for a quarter of the year. And so we got less funding, so that amount was a little bit more. They had more riders last year, but it didn't quite fill the gap. I think last year it was approximately $3,000 more, something like that. But no, we do the calculation the same every year. The number is going to change because our gap is different.
So we have a motion and a second for approval of the transportation agreement with St. John's Academy. Is there any more discussion? Any more discussion? All those in favor, say aye. Aye. Opposed, same sign. Motion carried. And we will host our budget hearing right at 6 o'clock. F, a formula for determining tuition agreements is there for your information. Are there any questions on that from the board? Okay. Dr. Leck, go ahead.
Want to just point out, and I think this shows that in your, in that calculation as well, but this year you'll see a little bit of a lower number in the tuition, and that has to do with ESSER reporting, and so it's just a little bit different for that year, for this year, but you'll see that kind of normalize back to what it had been in the past next year. But if there's questions, we can expound on that a little bit more, but it relates to ESSER reporting.
Any other questions from the board? Okay. Moving on to personnel. A, is there a motion for approval of the extended contract for Bob Thorson for an additional section of building construction for semester 1 at a salary of $5,952.92? Motion by Gail. Is there a second by Melissa? Any discussion? Any discussion? All those in favor, say aye. Aye. Opposed, same sign. Motion carried. 6, policy and procedures. A, is there a motion for approval of the first reading of policy ACBF, medical marijuana? Motion by Gail. Second by Dan. Any discussion? Dr. Leck provided some information. If you have any questions for him or any other discussion? No? There being no discussion, we have a motion and second for approval of the first reading of policy ACBF, medical marijuana. All those in favor say aye. Aye. Opposed, same sign. Motion carried. Number 7, tuition. Approval of the 2022 to 2023 school year tuition agreements for, number 1, approval of tuition agreement for, is it okay with the board we do all these in one motion, or would you want to do them separately? All in one motion? Okay. Approval of a tuition agreement for a first grade student to attend Montpelier Public Schools for the 2022 to 2023 school year. Approval of a tuition agreement for an 11th grade student to Jamestown Public School for the 2022 to 2023 school year. And number 3, approval of a tuition agreement for an 11th grade student to Jamestown Public School for the 2022 to 2023 school year. Is there a motion for 1 through 3? Motion by Melissa, second by Gail. Any discussion on these? Any discussion? If there's no discussion, all those in favor say aye. Aye. Opposed, same sign. Motion approved. 8, under other, approval to submit the LEA annual compliance report and subsequent individual school compliance reports. These are the ones that Dr. Leck discussed in his report. Is there a motion? Motion by Melissa. Is there a second? Second by Jason. Any discussion? Any discussion? There being no discussion, all those in favor say aye. Aye. Opposed, same sign. Motion carried. Are there any items for future agenda? And reminder for our retreat also. So if you have any items that are more in-depth discussion, we can move those to the retreat. If you think of anything, please let Dr. Leck or myself know. Under meetings to be scheduled, we have facility tour on Monday, October 3rd, 2022, beginning at 4 p.m. in the middle school. Following that, there's a school board regular meeting, Monday, October 3rd, 2022 at 5:15 in the Thompson Community Room. There's the North Dakota School Board Association Conference, October 27th and 28th in 2022 in Bismarck. And I believe that the SEC also has a meeting on October 5th at 11 a.m. And so if you have anything for me for that to report, I can take that. Any other meetings that we didn't have on here that you missed? Okay. Your monthly superintendent evaluation is Section 3, Human Resource Management, and Section 5, Community Relations. So should we wait to adjourn the meeting?
Well, you
After
don't
the-
have to adjourn this meeting.
No,
You
we'll
just
move into the
during this
public
meeting.
hearing, okay. We have the public budget hearing is scheduled at 6, so that's about 4 minutes. So go ahead, Jason.
Just out of curiosity, back to the extended contract for Mr. Thorson, just curious, is that due to just increased interest?
Yeah.
FTE loss somewhere else, or?
It could be both of those, really, but we just see the need for another section in construction. It's a very popular class program, and so we've seen a greater interest there. But some of that could be, it's hard to share anything but anecdotally on that, but it certainly could be another class wasn't offered, or, you know, the way their schedule worked out. But generally speaking, we have a great deal of interest in that program each year.
Any other questions on the agenda for tonight? I think we'll go ahead and call the public budget hearing to order. And Dr. Luck, you have a presentation for us. Would you like to share that with us, please?
I do, and I have a written memo. It's Board Memo 86, and I've done this every year, and I think it grows a little bit every year. You know, I'm not going to read through everything, and we've done board education on school finance, and there's lots of things that we have talked about that relate to this budget memo. But one of the things that I think is important for those that are watching or those that want to reference this discussion later, if anybody wants a copy of this, they could find it on the website, or they could reach out to me, and I'd be happy to share it. There's a number of different resources that I've embedded into this memo that might be helpful for people as they follow along. Because again, I'm not going to read everything verbatim, and I'm not going to go through and provide board education on all of these different areas that we've done before again, but they are referenced into this document. So just from a budget approval process standpoint, a preliminary budget was approved by the board, considered and approved on July 18th, and that means a formal budget requires this hearing, which we do sometime before we approve a formal budget, and that formal approval is planned for October 3rd. And just as a reminder, I know the board is aware of this, but it has to be done before October 10th. So for us, that's October 3rd that we'll ask for formal approval. You know, that's the process here. For the hearing, we don't have anybody here right now, although somebody could come. But we don't have anybody here now, but in general, the board, as a board, you must allow patrons to come and have a period of time. As I said earlier, I think we've had success with providing a little foundation and then opening it up to the floor if we do have patrons that wish to speak, or sometimes just wish to listen in and to provide comment if they may have a question. But I think broadcasting these, and thank you, Jason, as always, for being here, but I think the broadcasting has helped people and listen to this type of conversation and haven't felt the need to be here either. It's more of, it's important that we share the information. And then if there are questions that come up, give me a call, send me an email. Like I said, ask for this document. I'm happy to share it. But if anybody does come, typically what the board would do is provide some set period of time, 3 to 5 minutes, to provide public comment once this presentation is complete. I have provided a current request in our historical comparison. I like this chart. It starts on page 2, but I reference it in page 1. Because sometimes it's easy to think about taxes last year, and we don't always think about what happened 15 years ago. And in school funding, that's important. And it's important because we talk about our general fund being 70 mills. Well, it used to be 185. And there was a pretty significant difference between what was contributed locally and what was contributed by the state. When I first started, I think foundation aid was 2,800. I think 2,895, if I remember right. I think that was the number. It could be different than that, but it was in that area per pupil. But you levied to 185 mills, and so there was a pretty significant local contribution, and you see that represented in 2008, 2009. On a $100,000 home, the school portion of property tax was $1,063, almost $1,064. So significantly more than the proposed 2022-2023 amount of $459. Significantly different. But that's because the state has taken on a larger portion of that, of the funding for education. That went down from 185 to 110. Now it went down to 70. And there's conversations about that going down again, of school funding being the mechanism for property tax relief. Now, I can talk to you about that and say I'm a little bit concerned about that, if it's the right mechanism, but I think that's likely to happen regardless. And if the state wants to provide property tax, it's easy sometimes to look at schools. The concern comes when you look at, in the past, at 185 mills, there was a lot more local control and a local ability to address the ebbs and flows of things. When you declined a little bit in enrollment, you had more mills to help to address that loss in local revenue or in state aid. When the state aid is 5 times more than it was, or 4.5 times more than it was even 20 years ago, that's a lot harder. You know, enrollment loss is a big deal. It becomes a big deal. And, you know, we have less room to mitigate that. If you've looked over the last couple of years, I provided a chart that I want to talk about in just a little bit that addresses inflationary concerns and how the state aid payment hasn't quite kept up with inflation. And we know a couple of years ago we got zero. We got held harmless. And we know that hold harmless doesn't get the same money. Hold harmless means backwards. And I showed you in this memo how 1%, when we got 1%, 1%, or 2%, 1%, that was going backwards. And I'll show you that in just a little bit. But there needs to be a commitment to that foundation aid amount, because we don't get 10,237. That's the per pupil guarantee. We don't get that. And that's because it's inclusive of state and local revenue. And I'll talk about that in a bit. But it's really important that we think about that, because that general fund commitment has only increased across the state. I think 10 years ago, or I shouldn't say 10 years ago, when we first went to 70 mills, I think the average general fund, and I'm estimating, I don't have an exact number here, but it was about 61 mills. That was the average across the state. We've consistently had to be at 70, so we're in a different position in Jamestown. But that was about 61, 62 mills, probably 7 years ago. Now it's about 68 mills. The cap is 70. So that doesn't just mean Jamestown's struggling, it means across the state we are struggling there. And so when I say I get concerned a little bit about decreasing that amount even more, is that's even greater reliance on the state. And so if the state can afford to give 0, or the state affords to give 1%, when we're at the cap of what we can do locally, we have no ability to mitigate. And that's a concern. And I do, to be honest, wish that there was a different mechanism to provide tax relief, if that's the choice that is done. But like it was when we went to 185 to 110, that was legislative tax relief. When we went to 110 to 70, legislative tax relief. If that happens again, and that moves down to 40, that just takes away our ability to mitigate again. And it makes us even more reliant on the state. So I get concerned about that, but I also understand if the state wants to do it, that's probably the mechanism that they're going to do. And I think if we can provide property tax relief at the state level, then I'm glad that they're thinking about it. And I think it's an important thing to do. If you look at what we are asking, what we are proposing, it's the same total mill levy that we were asking for last year. And that's 102 mills. Again, the school portion of property tax on that $100,000 home would be $459. That doesn't account, I say this every year, but that doesn't account for updated valuation. If a home was reassessed and that home increased, yes, your taxes are going to go up because your home valuation increased. That has nothing to do with the school. Our levy is the same. And we can anticipate, based on our preliminary look, we can anticipate that special assessment levy, which is the reason we went from 100 to 102 last year. We can anticipate that going down to 101 next year. That doesn't impact this year, but when we have this meeting next year, we can anticipate that likely being at 101. Well, depending on what the state does with property tax relief and if they make any changes there. The other thing that I do get a little bit concerned about when we talk about using school for property tax relief is there are circuit breakers that exist for schools that don't exist in other municipalities that tax. For example, we have a 60 mil cap. We can't go above that. Well, you can in certain circumstances, but generally speaking, you don't go above 70. Well, that doesn't exist in other taxing entities. Those same caps and those same circuit breakers don't exist. So the fear becomes, we levy 30 mils less, somebody else levies 5 mils more because, well, you know what, everybody's getting 20, they're getting 30 from the school. So we'll just raise ours 5, then somebody else raises theirs 3, and all of a sudden that 30 mil tax relief becomes 22. So there's a concern there that that same level of circuit breaker doesn't exist for anybody else but schools. And I would hope that they consider that if they do put that on that mechanism, if they use schools again as the mechanism, that they consider that that shouldn't likely be the case. Hopefully I made sense there. But I get concerned about that too. I get concerned about others just filling that gap back in. And what was intended to be tax relief on the backs of school board or schools, and when we have limited authority to mitigate, becomes somebody else's boon. And I don't want that to happen either. I did provide, I think it's really important. It's really, really difficult to have this conversation and not understand school funding, and we've done it a number of times, from new board member orientation to board education. But I did include an overview of school funding, a specific presentation related to the North Dakota funding formula. If anybody wants to take a look through that, if board members have questions or if patrons have questions, I'm happy to talk about it. You'll find that I like to talk about it. I might be the only one, but I do like to talk about it. And then the September 22 state aid payment worksheet. We get these worksheets every month. They aren't finalized until November, but I do think it's helpful to look at that. And if there are questions, you can follow right along in those two presentations that I've linked along with the state aid payment, and just kind of track where everything goes. And hopefully that's enough of a primer to help people understand how the formula works. But it connects with local taxation. And I think that's really important to understand. When we say, and I've talked already, we levy 70 mills, right? Well, as a state, we're deducted 60 mills. So really what the school controls is 10 mills. When we levy 102 out of that general fund, those 70 mills, we control 10, because 70 is deducted from us, and it's a way that we equalize state funding. So the per pupil amount, $10,236. If you find, that goes right to the bottom of page 2. We do formula adjustments. There's two really important words that people need to recognize when they look at our state funding formula. Our funding formula works exactly the way it's designed to, and it does a good job of balancing, providing funding for all of the students that we have, but that's adequacy. So making sure that we have an adequate amount of money to educate students, that's one word that's important. As you look through the section 2, other program membership in the funding formula, that's all about adequacy. That recognizes that a special education student, there's greater costs there than another student, some more than others. We have students that are EL, and if they're English learners, there's additional costs that associates with that. And so the formula does a really nice job of quantifying what that additional amount might be and gives you weighted student units, okay? So that's adequacy, and the formula builds, again, the formula builds in additional money to make sure that schools have the ability to provide an adequate education. The equity piece is a little more complicated, and that has to do with where you're from, who you are, who makes up your school district. Are you a poverty-stricken district? Are you a wealthy district? In the past, school wealth was determined on land, and it is no longer. It is determined on students now. And that's closer to how it should be. And through equity adjustments, the formula mitigates where you live or what type of students you have. If you live in a high migrant area, for example, and you have greater needs there, that helps to address that. If you live in the West and you have oil, coal severance, coal conversion, oil and gas tax that impact your community and your school district, versus somebody in the central part of the state like Jamestown that has very limited impact to that. So that helps to equalize those payments between districts. What's good about that is I think it does exactly what it's supposed to. The bad part of that is that it's confusing. We expect that every student, common sense tells you, if a per pupil payment is $10,237, that's what we get, and we do not get that because we have to make adjustments. We talked about how 60 mills are really a state levy, how that is 60 mills that the state deducts from us for equalization. That helps us to balance between that really big property-rich district and that really small district. Look at Williston in the past. Williston was a very small district, but had a ton of students. And so they had real challenges being landlocked, surrounded by another district, and that became pretty challenging for them from a land standpoint. Now, you do an adjustment based on 60 mills. You deduct 60 mills off that state payment. That's a way to equalize land growth or land value. The second side of that is kind of addresses not quite just for geography, but other in lieu taxes. What happens in the West? Coal conversion, coal severance, oil and gas tax. That happens a lot in the West, not so much in the East, and certainly not in Central. But it's a way to, well, partially to share that revenue, but also to recognize that a school that has access to in lieu taxes may have a greater ability to provide that 10-237 than somebody that doesn't. And so they make deductions. So for us, I did a calculation, and so out of that 10-237, if you can consider our deduction of 60 mills, you can take $1,979 off what the state provides to us. Because out of that 10-237, remember, that is inclusive of state and local revenue. So what does the state kick in? What does the district have to kick in for their share? So in some districts, that's a lot more. In some districts, it's a lot less. We're kind of in the middle. But if you take that 10-237, we deduct $1979 for us in our district, and an additional $137 in lieu of tax deductions. So you add those together, what the state actually pays per pupil is $8,121. So that's the number that we get. And I said it was confusing because we talk about 10-237. That's the per pupil payment, but we have to know how the formula actually works and what the state actually provides. The other thing that makes this concerning, and we've talked about this at the board before, is when those deductions grow faster often than the percentage increase of the per pupil payment. And when that happens, the state contribution actually continues to go down. And one of the things I'd like to do is dig into this a little bit more and create a chart similar to my inflation chart that I added, and to see what that state amount in Jamestown has actually been, because I guarantee in the last 6 years it's gone down. It was higher 5 years ago, what the state provided to us in an apples-to-apples comparison. I mean, if we didn't decrease in enrollment, if enrollment stayed exactly the same, we would see a deduction in state aid over the last 6 years, almost certainly. And that'll continue to go down on an apples-to-apples comparison, not a declining enrollment standpoint. You can see, I did the math here for you. We saw a $101 increase in the per pupil this year. But our decrease, because of our deductions, is actually 137. So on an apples-to-apples comparison, if all things were equal, we had the same exact number of students, we lost $26 per kid. And where does that get made up? Local contribution. It has to get made up in those additional mills, the 10 mills from 60 to 70, tuition levy. Well, building fund is something different, but in what we contribute locally. That's why you see that increase over the last 8 years as in an average general fund. We've seen that increase from 61 to up to 68 across the state, and that's the reason why. So it becomes even more important. We are at an apex of how important it is to see that state aid amount increase. So I know that we need to have conversations about property tax relief. I think it's a good conversation to have. It's an important conversation to have. But we can't forget that 60% of what we levy out of those 102 mills, we never see the value of that. That's simply deducted from our state aid. So we're really talking about, 40% of our mills do we actually have influence over. That's an important piece that we recognize. Our caps are important. We're at the cap. We've been at the cap for a number of years, and we rely on that state aid increase. We rely on enrollment. If that's a double whammy, really it's a triple whammy. If we decline in enrollment, we're seeing a decrease in state aid on a couple different fronts. So that's concerning. And then it's just exacerbated by inflationary costs. And I did provide a chart that shows inflationary costs versus per pupil payments, and you see a huge shift that comes up. And in fairness, everybody's seeing that. That's not just school districts. Parks and Rec is seeing that same concern, City Council. When you go to every patron here, when they go to buy a gallon of milk, it's more expensive than it was. So that's not exclusive to us. But when you consider it as part of everything else, it's just another layer of concern that I have with our ability to keep up with inflation when we don't have any room to move, and we're beholden to the state in terms of what that percentage increase is.
Gail?
In listening to this, looking back at 21, when the legislature met, North Dakota's financial picture was quite a bit different than it is now. I think we are one of the states that had the biggest surpluses. I think as of the last time that was done was in May. What kind of messages are you getting from some of the preliminary meetings? Are the state education leaders in our legislature recognizing some of these challenges that districts make? And it looks like they're in a better position than I think, like I said, this might be, and it might even have surpassed that now, but this was the second high point in state revenue that we've had, like, of all time. So are they looking at this and realizing they may be in a position to help the students of North Dakota and help the school districts of North Dakota? I don't know what kind of feeling I know that's something we can't count on. It's like rolling dice, but are educational leaders like yourself trying to get that message to, and I know we won't know exactly what the composition of that legislature is until, after the second Tuesday of the first Monday in November.
Yeah. We have a lot of conversations about this. If you've heard me talk about the NDASA focus group, the Jamestown is very well represented. We are pretty active in that. We've had a lot of conversations about finance. Maybe the problematic thing, Gail, is that number one, inflation exists for everybody in everybody's budget. Number two, when there is a surplus, everybody wants we focus on our piece of the pie, and as legislators, they have to focus on every piece of the pie. And all we can do is advocate for what we need, and how that operates, and trust in our legislators to make the best choices that they can, to be prudent, to provide everybody with what they need. I think they've done a good job for education in my 20 years as a superintendent. We always have concerns, and we can always have more things, but more than anything, I think they listen to us, and I think they'll continue to listen to us. But it's a concern with, are we going to be able to fill the gap? And we have, some of my concerns, as I outline, financial shortcomings. We can only creatively and examine our expenses, and savvy budgeting only gets you so far. When you want to make real gains, you have to cut, or you have to have more funding. And we have some really we need to continue to make sure that we're competitive with staff. That we all know that. And we know that that's the biggest piece of our budget, salary and benefits. We need to be able to move the bar there. And we have to have an ability to do that. And that's going to come through those types of measures. And so we can't get grants for everything every year, and we've been able to do that. We can't depend on ESSER every year, because that won't always be there. We've been able to mitigate some things for a period of time, but we're really, at a critical juncture, I think. And those are not easy conversations to have, but right now, that's, you see what it looks like. We're kind of capped out.
Gail?
And as we're looking at that task force, will the task force be also looking at what kind of budgetary things are involved in keeping, as we're looking at having all possibilities remain open, will we be looking at what cost savings could be by different things that we explore?
So any
So
solution,
if
yeah.
we see like
Yep.
some of those.
I think those things have to go hand in hand. When you have a solution, there needs to be a cost analysis of those types of solutions, right? We add something, what's the cost? We remove something, what's the savings? And there's, I think those things have to go hand in hand. So yes.
Jason?
So the 60 mills that we don't even see, but we pay, that's consistent across the state. Is that serving its purpose? Is that too high? Are they collecting too much? Have they proven that they need all of that? Is there any wiggle room there that could be lowered?
So that would actually be lowered if we're talking property tax, a buyback. If it were reducing property tax again, that would be the mechanism that it occurs with. And you bring up a different issue, Jason, and that's the 60 mil deduct. And to answer your question, no, not everybody is at 60 mils because they can't be. There's contradiction with other law. It's the 12% growth. If you're growing significantly, then you can't levy more, and you actually go backwards. So if your taxable value, just to make this really simple, if your taxable value goes up greater than 12%, your mill levy has to go down in the general fund. So if you are at 60 mills, for example, and your taxable value, like it did in some pretty expansive growth that happened out west, was going up 25%. Well, if you were at 60, now you're, say, at 50, 52. Well, the state didn't punish you when you couldn't raise it up, and they'll deduct you by 52. Well, the problem with that is that over time that has been pretty significant, and now you have schools like Jamestown that are levying 70 mills and getting deducted 60, and you have schools out west that are levying a total of 60, have created building fund or have created new buildings, and they're only being deducted by 38 because that's what they could afford to levy. And so one of the benefits of making this change, this property tax reduction, would be then everybody would be at 30 and it would be locked in. There wouldn't be this well, we couldn't levy, so it would be everybody's at 30. The problem I have with the 60 is that it's not the same for everybody. And I think if we could go back in time and had foreseen that challenge, I think everybody would have said the same thing. Everybody's at 60. And that's just the way we're equalizing the formula. But that didn't happen. That isn't the way it played out. And now we're addressing that. So people in some communities are paying more and some are paying less of that share of things.
Go ahead, Gail.
Is there a willingness to look at that particular issue that you raised by the state ed leaders?
Yep. Well, that would be addressed in the property tax reduction, and we have talked about that, and there is, that's a conversation that's ongoing. And in fairness, like I said, legislators couldn't have foreseen that kind of explosive valuation. Nobody could have foreseen that. Ed leaders didn't, legislators didn't. Had we had foresight, we would have said 60, and that's just the way it is. But, that doesn't significantly change the game statewide, but it does create a little bit of inequity between districts.
Diane?
Well, without meaning to embarrass Dr. Lack, I do want the public to know that not every superintendent around the state has this interest and passion in this subject. And we are very lucky as a school district to have him. And I appreciate the work he puts into it.
And explains it well.
Yes, and explains it well. I think our public here in Jamestown is very interested. They're very savvy, and they would have an interest in knowing the details that he provides. Thank you.
Well, thank you. Just to reiterate, the document that I've put together that I've referenced in our conversations is available if anybody wants to see it and click on links and learn a little bit more there. I'm happy to share that. But just to get back to where we started, We are anticipating 102 mills, which is the same as what we have. It's significantly less than property tax in 2008, 2009. I'm still concerned about how, as a district, we continue to do the very, very best we can for our students and the very, very best we can for our staff with the limits that are in place. I'm concerned about over-reliance on state funding formula, but I'll also say this is what we asked for. We asked for the state to take on a greater level of funding, and we got it. We can't ask for something, get it, and then complain about how it got to us. Because this is what we got. We just have to continue to work with our legislators and address challenges that we see. But I am concerned about that, and I want to make sure that we are as transparent as we can about that concern, and that we're advocating for as much flexibility as we can get, and that we're intelligent and reasonable in working with our legislators on what that state funding amount per pupil should be. But I will be honest, I don't know that everybody understands that we don't get 10,237 per student. The other thing that I didn't mention that I think is important is the Common Schools Trust Fund, which pays a large portion of that 10,237. That increases significantly every biennia, significantly. So much, in fact, that even when we get that $101 more per year, the state per pupil, the state contribution goes down every year. Every single year, because the Common Schools Trust Fund fills that bucket plus a little bit more. And so if you do an analysis of the funding commitment in the general fund to education, it continues to go down every year. And I think we would do well even if it just stayed the same. Even if that funding commitment to education was the same. What that would do to per pupil payment, I'm interested to find out. But I would like to even just see that funding amount stay the same. Not the 10,237, I'm talking the general fund commitment. Because then you wouldn't see a decrease in that per pupil, what the state actually pays school districts every year. You would see that stabilizer increase. So.
Any other questions?
Formal budget approval on October 3rd.
Yep, we'll have the formal budget approval on October 3rd. And if some of our public, if they had other commitments and were not able to make it to our public budget hearing this evening, and if they have questions or would like this document or informational document, just contact our central office and we'll make sure that we get it to you. And Dr. Leck is also available for questions if the public has any questions. Well, this concludes our public budget hearing for this evening. Is there any other questions on our agenda before we adjourn this evening? Okay. There being, Sally, did you have anything? No? Okay. There being no further business before the board, the meeting is adjourned. Thank you, everyone.